Right now, somewhere in the world, there is a city with running water, working grain markets, and people who have no reason to believe it will all stop. They wake up, they go about their lives, they trust the river will rise when it's supposed to, and the rains will come like they always have. That trust is very old, and about 4,200 years ago, civilizations across the ancient world were built on exactly that same trust. Then something happened. Around 2200 BC, the ancient world seems to fracture all at once. The Akkadian Empire, the first true empire in human history, collapses. Egypt's old kingdom, the civilization that built the Great Pyramids at their absolute height of power, falls into a period of chaos so severe that later Egyptians would look back on it with horror. Cities in the Indus Valley, some of the most sophisticated urban centers anywhere on Earth at the time, begin to empty out. Settlements across Syria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and the Levant are abandoned, burned, or simply go silent in the archaeological record. Not one civilization, not two. Many, across thousands of miles, within what appears to be a relatively short window of time. That is the mystery at the center of tonight's story, and it is genuinely unsolved. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these. So settle in, and before you drift off, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I check them, and it's always this wonderful thing: Cairo at midnight, Toronto at 2 in the morning, someone in Melbourne having breakfast. Tell me where you are. Now, back to 2200 BC. Here is the question that keeps archaeologists and climate scientists up at night. Was there a single cause? Some global trigger that sent shockwaves through every corner of the connected ancient world at once? Or were these separate crises, each with their own local roots, that just happened to cluster together in the same rough century, creating the illusion of a single catastrophic moment? There is a leading candidate for the single cause theory. Scientists call it the 4.2 kilo-year event. It refers to a period of severe, widespread drought that the geological record suggests hit much of the northern hemisphere around 4,200 years ago. Lake sediments, cave formations, pollen records from multiple continents all point to something real. A prolonged drying, a failure of the monsoons, rivers running lower than anyone alive could remember. Whether that climate shift was the cause of everything that followed, a contributing factor among many, or more of a backdrop against which societies that were already under pressure finally gave way, that is where the debate lives today. And we are going to sit with that uncertainty honestly, because the evidence deserves that kind of respect. What we will do tonight is travel through the regions one by one. We will walk the canals of Mesopotamia when the Akkadian Empire was straining at its edges. We will stand at the edge of the Nile when the floods became unpredictable. We will look at the quiet transformation of the Indus cities, which tells a story so different from the others that it complicates every simple explanation. And we will look at the trade networks connecting all of these worlds, the copper routes, the grain ships, the messengers carrying clay tablets between kings, and ask what happens when a system that depends on everything working together suddenly finds that nothing is. The ancient world felt permanent to the people inside it. Most worlds do, and that is perhaps the most quietly unsettling thing about what happened around 2200 BC. Let's begin. Before we watch it fall, we have to understand what it looked like standing. And here is the first thing worth knowing. When historians talk about collapse in the ancient world, they don't necessarily mean what that word suggests when you first hear it. They don't always mean burning cities and mass graves and a sudden silence where there used to be noise. Sometimes collapse looks like that. But more often it means something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. Political fragmentation, where a central authority that once controlled vast territories simply stops being obeyed. Urban decline, where cities don't explode but slowly empty. People drifting away to smaller settlements or back to the land. Trade contraction, where goods that used to move reliably across hundreds of miles stop moving. And demographic shifts, where populations don't vanish but scatter, thin out, reorganize around different centers of gravity. Collapse, in the archaeological sense, is often less like a building falling, and more like a building slowly becoming a ruin while people are still living inside it. That distinction matters for everything that follows. Now picture the world around 2300 BC, roughly a century before the period we are investigating. Not the whole world. Just the arc of territory, stretching from the Nile Delta east through the Levant and into Mesopotamia, then curving south and east again toward the Persian Gulf and the Indus Valley. This was the most densely interconnected region on Earth at the time, and it was remarkable. In northeastern Africa, the Old Kingdom of Egypt was at the height of what it would ever be. The Great Pyramid complexes at Giza had already been built. The administrative machinery of the pharaonic state was sophisticated enough to organize thousands of workers, feed them, house them, track grain across enormous distances, and maintain ideological control through an elaborate system of temples, priesthoods, and royal mythology. The Nile was the spine of all of it. Every year it flooded, deposited rich silt across the agricultural land on either side, and receded on a schedule that Egyptian farmers had been reading for generations. The state's entire structure rested on that reliability. Taxes were calculated in grain, officials were paid in grain, armies were fed on grain. The Nile was not just a river, it was the operating system of a civilization. Move northeast into Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, and you find the Akkadian Empire. This was, depending on how you count, the first true empire in human history. Sargon of Akkad, who came to power around 2334 BC, had done something no one had managed before at that scale. He unified the city-states of Sumer under a single centralized authority, installed governors loyal to him rather than to local traditions, and extended Akkadian control from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. The cities of this empire, places like Nippur, Lagash, were extraordinary. They had monumental temples called ziggurats, professional scribal schools, legal codes, and commercial networks sophisticated enough to track loans, property transfers, and long-distance trade in writing. The writing itself, cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, has survived. We can still read it. We know the names of the merchants, the prices of the goods, the complaints of farmers who felt they were being taxed unfairly. This was not a simple society. Then go further east, past the Iranian plateau, and you reach the Indus Valley. Here, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, a third urban civilization had been flourishing for centuries. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were, in terms of urban planning, arguably the most sophisticated anywhere in the world at the time. Grid street layouts, standardized fired brick, drainage systems, public water infrastructure, a still undeciphered writing system, and a striking uniformity of material culture across an enormous geographic range, suggesting either strong central coordination or deeply shared cultural norms, or both. The Indus world is in some ways the most mysterious of the three because we cannot yet read their texts. But the archaeology speaks clearly enough. These were cities, real ones. What made all of this more than just three separate impressive things was how connected they were. Mesopotamian cylinder seals have been found in Indus contexts. Indus carnelian beads show up in Mesopotamian tombs. Timber from Lebanon moved down through the Levant into Egypt. Copper from Oman sailed up the Gulf to Mesopotamian ports. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone the ancient world treasured, travelled from mines in northeastern Afghanistan along routes that crossed multiple political boundaries before ending up inlaid in the death mask of a Sumerian queen. The connections were real, physical, documented in the ground. These civilizations were not islands. They were nodes in a network, and the network had its own logic, its own fragilities. Those fragilities are worth naming clearly, because they are part of what makes the period around 2200 BC so consequential. Almost every major centre was dependent on irrigation agriculture, which requires continuous maintenance and is extraordinarily sensitive to changes in water supply. Centralized elite institutions, the palaces, the temples, the granary systems operated on the assumption of reliable surplus. Taxation systems extracted that surplus up through layers of administration, and the long supply chains connecting regions meant that a disruption in one place could cascade through the whole web in ways that nobody at the time would have had the framework to anticipate. Now, how do we actually know any of this? The evidence comes from several directions at once. There are royal inscriptions boasting of conquests and building projects, which stop abruptly. There are king lists that suddenly compress into rapid successions of rulers, a pattern that tends to indicate instability. Settlement archaeology, meaning the careful mapping of which sites were occupied and which were not across different periods, shows patterns of abandonment that can be dated. And increasingly, scientists are reading the climate record directly, in the chemistry of stalagmites growing in caves, in the pollen layers trapped in lake sediments, in ice cores drilled from glaciers that were quietly recording the atmosphere while all of this human drama unfolded below. That last category is where some of the most important and most contested evidence lives, and it takes us directly to the question of what the climate was actually doing around 2200 BC. The climate record is where the story gets genuinely strange, and also where it gets genuinely complicated in ways that matter for everything else we're going to talk about. Scientists have given the event a name, the 4.2 kiloyear event, which just means the climate anomaly that occurred approximately 4,200 years ago, or roughly 2200 BC, give or take a century on either side. In the formal geological timeline, it now marks the boundary between two subdivisions of the current geological epoch. That is not a small thing. Geologists do not draw those lines casually. The decision to place a boundary there reflects a genuine, measurable signal in the Earth's archive. Something happened. The question is exactly what, and exactly where, and exactly how bad. Here is what the proxies actually show. In caves across a remarkable span of territory, from China to Oman to the Mediterranean basin, speleothems, those slow-growing columns of calcium carbonate, stalactites and stalagmites, have preserved a chemical record of past rainfall. When scientists measure the ratio of oxygen isotopes locked inside the layers of calcite, they can reconstruct how much rain was falling above the cave at any given time. Multiple speleothem records from different locations cluster around the same signal, a period of reduced moisture, beginning somewhere around 2200 BC and persisting, in some records, for 1 to 2 centuries. Lake sediments tell a similar story in several key locations, in West Africa, in the Middle East, and across parts of the Indian subcontinent. The layers deposited around this period show lower water levels, sometimes dramatically lower, along with chemical signatures of increased evaporation. In the Sea of Galilee basin, in Lake Van in eastern Turkey, in records from the Arabian Peninsula, the picture is consistent enough to be striking. And pollen cores from the same period show shifts in vegetation, forests contracting, drought-tolerant species expanding, landscapes reorganizing in ways that take centuries to recover. Then there is the dust. In ice cores drilled from glaciers in places like Kilimanjaro and the high Andes, researchers have found elevated concentrations of wind-blown dust corresponding to this interval. Dust in ice cores typically indicates dry, exposed land surfaces with reduced vegetation cover, the kind of conditions that exist when rainfall fails persistently enough to kill the plants holding soil in place. More dust means more bare ground. More bare ground means less rain was falling to keep it covered. It is a signature of landscape stress. Now here is where the story refuses to be simple, which is actually one of the most important things to understand about this period. The 4.2K event was not a uniform global drought that hit everywhere at the same moment with the same intensity. It almost certainly did not work that way. The proxy records, as comprehensive as they are becoming, show real regional variation. Some areas that models would predict to have been badly affected show ambiguous or even contradictory signals. Some regions experienced the worst stress earlier, some later, some not obviously at all in the existing records. This matters enormously if you are trying to use the climate event to explain a set of simultaneous political collapses, because the collapses were not perfectly simultaneous either, and the climate signal was not perfectly uniform. The mechanisms proposed for what caused the 4.2K event involve the basic drivers of regional rainfall across Afro-Eurasia. The summer monsoon systems, which bring rainfall to South Asia and the African interior, are sensitive to sea surface temperature patterns in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic. A weakening of monsoon intensity, whether driven by changes in ocean heat distribution or shifts in atmospheric circulation, could simultaneously reduce rainfall across an enormous swath of territory from the Sahel to the Indus Valley. The westerly storm tracks that bring winter moisture to the Mediterranean, the Levant and the Iranian plateau are similarly sensitive, capable of shifting northward or weakening in ways that leave long dry spells across the exact regions where the ancient world's most complex civilizations happen to be concentrated. What this probably looked like on the ground was not one catastrophic dry year. It was a run of years, maybe a decade, maybe 2 or 3, in which the rains came late or came short or failed entirely in critical growing seasons. For farmers working without irrigation buffers, that kind of persistent shortfall is existential. Even a 15 or 20% reduction in rainfall, sustained across several consecutive years, can push a subsistence agricultural system past the point where stored grain can compensate. The first year, you eat your reserves. The second year, you eat your seed grain. By the third year, you are making decisions about which fields to abandon and which mouths you cannot keep feeding. And this is where climate stress becomes social stress, which is the real mechanism worth understanding. Harvest shortfalls do not stay in the fields. They travel through the entire architecture of a complex society at remarkable speed. Grain prices spike. Labourers hired to maintain irrigation canals cannot be paid. Taxes that were calculated against expected yields become impossible to collect. Soldiers still need to eat whether or not the harvest came in. Palace and temple institutions that depended on reliable surplus start making hard choices about which obligations to honour. And crucibles, political legitimacy in these societies was intimately tied to the perception that the ruler could maintain order, ensure abundance, and stand as intermediary between the people and the forces that controlled rainfall and flood. When the floods failed year after year, that legitimacy cracked. Not all at once, but in ways that cumulative pressure could eventually break. There is also the migration effect. When one region dries out, people move. They move toward water, toward the river valleys and the coasts and the highland zones where springs still run. That movement is rarely peaceful. It creates pressure on the receiving regions, introduces competition for resources that had previously been adequate, and can tip political systems that were already stressed into actual conflict. What you are left with is not a neat single cause. It is a cascade. Climate instability creates agricultural stress. Agricultural stress strains political finances. Political strain erodes legitimacy. Eroded legitimacy invites challenge. Migration from drought zones adds additional pressure, and all of this happens in a network of interconnected societies where the shockwaves do not stop at any border. That is the framework to hold in mind as we look, region by region, at what the archaeology and the texts actually show, starting where the written record is richest, Mesopotamia. By the time the climate began to turn unstable around 2200 BC, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was ruled, on paper at least, by something new in human history. Not just a big city-state, not just a king who bullied his neighbours into sending tribute, a real empire. The Akkadian Empire, built first by Sargon and then enlarged and reorganized by his successors, stitched together dozens of previously independent Sumerian and Akkadian-speaking cities into a single, multi-city system. From the rain-fed plains of northern Mesopotamia to the irrigated alluvium of the deep south, from the middle Euphrates near Mari to the Zagros foothills in the east, kings at Akkad claimed authority. That claim mattered. It meant standard weights and measures circulating across hundreds of kilometres. It meant scribes recording rations, labour assignments and tax deliveries in 2 languages but under one royal seal. It meant provincial governors appointed by the centre, rather than local dynasties ruling purely for themselves. In human terms, it meant that the stability of people living hundreds of miles apart was now tied, however loosely, to the fortunes of a single royal household and a single administrative machine. When that machine began to fail, the effects were not confined to one city's walls. The surviving tablets from late Akkadian times show hints of that strain. Ration lists that become irregular, legal documents that mention disruptions to normal procedures, letters that complain, in the careful formulae of the time, about shortages and insecurity. Archaeology adds another layer. In parts of northern Mesopotamia, where Akkadian kings had pushed out to control grainlands and pasture, you see an arc of sites that tell a similar story. For several centuries before 2200 BC, small towns and villages spread across the plains, farmsteads dotting landscapes that had been lightly used before. Then, over a few generations, many of those sites thin out or are simply abandoned. In some places there are traces of hurried fortifications or destruction layers that hint at violence. In others there is just absence, houses not rebuilt, fields not maintained. The archaeological equivalent of a conversation that trails off and never resumes. Later Mesopotamian scribes, looking back on this era, remembered it in darker colours still. Sumerian laments composed centuries after Akkad fell describe cities emptied of people, fields overrun by weeds, the rich turned into beggars, mothers unable to feed their children. They are stylized texts full of religious imagery and poetic exaggeration. But that kind of language usually does not arise out of calm and prosperity. So what was happening? One obvious suspect is the same thing we have just been talking about, drought. But in Mesopotamia, drought didn't land everywhere in the same way. The north, the region that Akkadians called the upper country, depended heavily on rainfall agriculture. Wheat and barley grown in broad open fields with only minimal canal work. When winter rains were good, this was some of the most productive land in the Near East. When the rains faltered for a year, people tightened belts and drew down stores. When they faltered for many years in a row, the system itself became fragile. South Mesopotamia, by contrast, lived and died by irrigation. The lower Tigris-Euphrates plain received very little rainfall even in good years. Farmers here diverted river water through an intricate network of canals and ditches built up across centuries. Their vulnerability wasn't the rain directly, but the river regimes, snowmelt and rainfall in upstream catchments, the level of the water table, the siltation of channels. If a regional climate event reduced rainfall over the northern and eastern highlands that fed the rivers, that stress would ripple differently through the two zones. Northern farmers might see their fields dry up directly. Southern farmers might feel it as lower water in the canals, shorter flood seasons, and greater competition for water between upstream and downstream communities. The textual record suggests both regions were affected. One famous Akkadian text, sometimes called the Curse of Akkad, portrays the gods withdrawing rain and fertility as punishment for royal arrogance. Fields yielded no grain, irrigation canals carried brackish, undrinkable water, and famine stalked the land. Whether or not the story is remembering a specific sequence of events, it reflects a mental world in which widespread agricultural failure was imaginable enough to be used as a literary weapon. From a modern perspective, you don't need divine intervention. Put a multi-year rainfall shortfall in the upper country, and diminished river flow feeding the south at the same moment an empire is trying to provision garrisons, maintain far-flung canal systems, and move surplus grain to the capital, and you have a built-in recipe for crisis. Because empire magnifies both abundance and scarcity. In the early expansionist decades of Akkad, control over multiple ecological zones was a strength. Good harvests in one region could, in theory, offset bad harvests in another. Grain could move along canal and river networks, carried in boatloads from surplus provinces to deficit ones. Conquered cities paid in kind, sending food, textiles and labour that supported royal projects. But under persistent stress, every part of that system turns into a source of friction. If northern farmers cannot reliably produce surplus, provincial governors struggle to fulfil quotas. If canal maintenance in the south is underfunded because grain is short and labour is being redirected to military needs, water delivery becomes more erratic. If garrisons on the fringes are underfed, discipline breaks down. Soldiers desert, turn to raiding, or shift their loyalties to local strongmen who promise more immediate protection. That is where political military pressure comes in. The later Akkadian rulers, particularly Naram Sin, are remembered as great conquerors, but many of their campaigns look through a different lens, like responses to rising instability. Inscriptions describe putting down rebellions, subduing cities that had thrown off the yoke, pacifying borderlands where vassals had ceased to obey. Think about that in the context of repeated poor harvests and rising internal discontent. City councils and temple elites in places like Uruk, or Lagash were not powerless. They had their own local support, their own wealth, and their own ideas about how authority should be distributed. When imperial demands began to feel unbearable or simply unrealistic, refusing to send grain or labour might start to look less like treason and more like survival. Nearby highland and steppe groups also watched these dynamics. If the central state seemed weak, caravans became targets. Frontier fortresses became tempting prizes. Border tribes, long managed through a mix of intimidation and gifts, recalculated their odds. Which brings us to one of the most infamous names in this story, the Gutians. In Mesopotamian literature, the Gutians are the classic foreign menace from the eastern mountains. Later kings describe them as uncultured, godless, incapable of proper agriculture, a kind of walking curse on civilized land. One king of Ur III, writing long after Akkad's fall, boasts about having expelled them and restored order, implying that Gutian domination had been a time of chaos. On the king lists, the Gutians appear as a line of rulers who ruled without kingship after the dynasty of Akkad. It is a tantalizing phrase, suggesting a period when legitimate kingship, as the scribes understood it, was interrupted. The older historical narrative took this at face value. Akkad fell because Gutian hordes poured out of the Zagros, smashed the empire, and plunged Sumer into a dark age. Archaeology tells a quieter, more complicated story. There is no evidence for a sudden, uniform layer of destruction across Mesopotamia that would match a single sweeping invasion. Instead, we see some cities showing fire and rubble at slightly different times, others declining more gradually, and still others, importantly, continuing quite calmly with their own local administrations. The Gutians themselves are hard to pin down. We do not have clear settlements we can confidently label as theirs. We have scattered references, some personal names in texts, and the hostile descriptions of later Sumerian and Akkadian writers. It is entirely possible that Gutian was a catch-all label for various mountain and pastoral groups who were always present on the fringes of the lowlands, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, sometimes serving as mercenaries. In that view, what changed around the end of Akkad was not that a completely new people appeared, but that the political and military balance shifted in ways that allowed these long-standing neighbours to exert more pressure on the lowland cities. If the central army could no longer keep them in check, if provincial governors were preoccupied with local revolts, or simply lacked resources to patrol the borders, then Gutian bands could interfere with trade routes, seize herds, and perhaps even install their own leaders as rulers in some cities. Later scribes, looking back from more orderly times, would experience that as an age of barbarians in power, an interlude between real dynasties, but it fits just as well into a picture of fragmentation, an imperial framework dissolving into overlapping claims, local powers rising and falling, external groups exploiting openings, and fragmentation, unlike a single dramatic fall, always leaves pieces behind. Even as Akkad as a royal centre lost its grip, life went on in much of southern Mesopotamia. Some cities show continuity of settlement, with administrative practices shifting only gradually from imperial to local styles. Seal designs change, titles change, gods in inscriptions change emphasis. But the basic structures of urban life, of fields and canals and temple economies persist. In the north, where abandonment was more widespread, there are signs that populations did not simply vanish but moved. People seem to have drifted towards zones with more reliable water, closer to main river channels, into the Piedmont where springs still flowed, or southward into the irrigation heartland. That movement would have increased pressure on the surviving cities but also replenished their labour force. Within a century or two, new political configurations emerged. The so-called Second Dynasty of Lagash rose to prominence in the south, claiming to restore justice, repair canals, and re-establish proper offerings to the gods. Not long after, the kings of Ur, the Ur III dynasty, built what was in many ways a reimagined version of empire, with more formalized bureaucracy, more detailed accounting, and a careful rhetoric of caring for the destitute. Those later rulers, like all successful politicians, turned the memory of the Akkadian breakdown to their advantage. They spoke of the preceding period as chaos from which they had rescued the land. They cast the Gutians as villains so that they could cast themselves as saviours. In doing so, they preserve for us a distorted but invaluable echo of genuine hardship. When you step back, the Akkadian story begins to look less like a simple narrative of rise and barbarian destruction, and more like a case study in how a tightly linked multi-city system responds to overlapping shocks. Climate stress strained agriculture. Strained agriculture undermined tax flows and royal obligations. Political legitimacy cracked. Local elites asserted themselves. Peripheral groups advanced. The imperial fabric thinned, tore, and then rewove itself into new patterns. Collapse, in this corner of the world, did not mean an end to cities or to writing, or even to the dream of empire. It meant a change in who sat at the centre, and in how that centre related to the landscapes of water and grain that ultimately sustained it. South of Akkad, older Sumerian cities had their own stories of adaptation waiting to unfold, and the soil beneath them was carrying a different kind of long-term stress, one that would not announce itself in a single bad year, but in the slow creep of salt. In the deep south, the world did not end when Akkad's kings lost control. If you were standing on the walls of Ur or walking the quays of Uruk, you would still see barges moving along the canals. You would still hear donkeys braying under loads of grain, scribes muttering as they pressed wedges into wet clay, temple singers reciting hymns to gods whose cults had been old before Sargon was born. But under your feet, in the soil that fed all of this, a different crisis was slowly gathering. Southern Mesopotamia's wealth had always been artificial, in the literal sense of the word. It was artifice, engineering. The land itself was flat, low, and almost rainless. Without human intervention, it was scrub and marsh. With canals, levees, and a million shovel strokes of labour, it became one of the most intensively farmed regions on Earth. That was the miracle and the trap. Irrigation took water from the rivers when they were high, and spread it across fields that would otherwise have been dry dust. It allowed harvests big enough to feed craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, and priests who did not farm themselves. It supported big cities, specialized industries, monumental temples, and the scribal schools that produced all those neat cuneiform texts. But every time water passed over those fields, it carried something else with it: dissolved salts. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing down from the highlands, pick up minerals from the rocks they cut through. When you flood a field, the water spreads out, some of it soaks into the soil, some evaporates, and what's left behind is the salt. If the next year you flood again, and the next year again, and the water table is high so that drainage is poor, those salts accumulate. You don't notice much at first. Barley is a tough crop. It can tolerate salty conditions that would kill wheat. But over generations, if irrigation is badly managed, if water sits on the land too long, if drain canals are neglected, the white crust creeps up toward the surface. Yields fall. Plants struggle. Patches of field go patchy and then barren. Sumerian farmers understood at least part of this problem, even if they did not explain it in modern chemical terms. Some early texts already talk about the importance of flushing fields, running large volumes of water through at certain times to wash harmful substances down and away. Canal regulations carved on stele spell out who is responsible for cleaning silted channels and who will be punished if water is misused. But knowledge is one thing. Sustaining coordinated action over centuries is another. When an empire is strong, it can mobilize labor on a huge scale to maintain and improve the canal network. When political authority fragments, that maintenance becomes much harder. After Akkad's decline, the old Sumerian cities were back to dealing with each other more directly. There was no single imperial centre dictating canal policy from the north. Instead, you had a patchwork of city-states sharing, competing over, and sometimes fighting about the same water. Imagine a main canal carrying river water past City A, then onto the fields of City B downstream. If City A decides to draw off more water to secure its own harvest, City B suffers. If City B responds by cutting a branch canal illegally, or by sabotaging an upstream dike, the conflict spreads. All of this took place against a background of long-term salinization that no single good year of rain or river flow could fix. Archaeobotanical evidence, the charred seeds and plant remains preserved in ancient layers, suggests that in parts of southern Mesopotamia there was a clear shift over time from wheat to barley as the main staple. Wheat, which is more sensitive to salt, becomes rarer. Barley, more tolerant but with slightly lower prestige in some texts, takes over. Some scholars think this shift had been underway for centuries already. By 2200 BC, part of a slow adjustment to soils that had been worked and watered since before the first cities rose. Others argue that the stresses of the 4.2K climate event, with rivers perhaps carrying less water for a while, accelerated the process by making it harder to leach salts out. Whatever the exact timing, the result would have been visible to you if you were a farmer. Fields you remembered from childhood as lush now looked thin. Yields you had once counted on were no longer reliable. The rations you received from the temple, measured in standardized amounts of grain, might stay the same on clay, but in your stomach they went less far because the grain stores were tighter, and mixing in more barley or more husks became tempting. Administrative texts from the centuries after Akkad show these fine adjustments. Ration lists carefully distinguish between different grades of barley and different categories of worker. Standard monthly portions for a full status male labourer, for a female worker, for children, for specialised craftsmen. These lists are, in one sense, a triumph of bureaucracy, but they are also a sign of an economy that is counting every measure. When scarcity looms, the easiest lever to pull is labour. Temple estates and palaces in cities like Lagash, Umma, and Ur had always relied on corvée, the obligation of households to provide days or months of unpaid work on public projects. In stable times, that might mean periodic work on canals, harvest crews, or construction. In harder times, those demands could intensify. We have texts in which local rulers boast about reopening ancient canals, digging new branches, reclaiming land from marsh and steppe. The scale of these projects is immense. Tens of thousands of workers, organised into teams under foremen, fed by ration distributions calculated to the litre. To the ruler, this was framed as pious duty, restoring proper order to the land, making sure the gods received their due offerings. To the average farmer drafted for weeks away from his own fields, it might have felt less glorious. Temples, which controlled large tracts of land and herds, played a central role in this system. They were not just religious centres, but economic hubs. They received offerings and taxes, managed grain silos and flocks, redistributed food and textiles to dependent workers, and financed canal works both directly and through obligations owed to them. In periods of stress, temple economies could act as buffers. Surpluses stored in good years might be used to support the poor in lean times, at least according to royal inscriptions that like to portray kings as protectors of widows and orphans. But they could also act as amplifiers of inequality. Households deeply tied to temple service had less room to manoeuvre when harvests failed. Debts taken on to bridge bad years could lead to loss of land or even debt servitude. Several later rulers made political capital by proclaiming freedom decrees, cancelling certain debts and returning pledged lands. Such proclamations only make sense in a context where the squeeze had become widely felt. Between temple institutions and ordinary villagers, a new layer of power could form: local strongmen. When central authority weakens, somebody still has to decide who gets access to water at the head of a canal, who organises defence against raiders, who arbitrates disputes. In the post-Akkadian landscape, some of the people who took on those roles were traditional city elites, priests, high officials, members of old dynastic families. Others may have been outsiders who had risen through the military or through control of key resources. Their power was often tied directly to control of labour and water. A man who could guarantee protection of your village from Gutian raiders, or who could ensure your fields were watered when others were not, could demand loyalty, service, and a cut of your harvest in return. In some cities, such figures appear in the written record as governors, ensi, ruling under the nominal authority of a distant king. In others, they seize kingship outright. This is part of what makes recovery so uneven. From a distance, later historians look back and see the rise of the Earthry dynasty as a clean restoration. After chaos, order; after Gutian rule, proper kingship again. But if you zoom in city by city, village by village, the picture is more mottled. Some centres clearly contracted. Certain temples show reduced building activity, smaller staffs, less lavish offerings. Houses in poorer quarters shrink or disappear. In those places, families may have drifted away, pushing toward places where canals still flowed reliably. Elsewhere, there are signs of surprising continuity, even modest growth. The city of Gersu, for example, remains an important administrative node in the centuries around 2200 BC, with archives of tablets that barely pause through political shifts. Fields are still measured, workers still assigned, oxen still counted. New centres also come to the fore. Lagash, which had been a major player in pre-Akkadian times, experiences what some historians call a second dynasty after the empire's fall. Its rulers carve inscriptions on stone stelae describing themselves as social reformers. They claim to have abolished certain abuses, protected the poor from exploitation by officials, and crucially, restored neglected canals. Whether we take their self-portraits at face value or not, the focus on water management is telling. Legitimacy in Sumer was tied not just to prowess in war or generosity in building temples, but to competence in handling the delicate, slow-burning crisis of the soil. Further downstream, would eventually eclipse them all, building ziggurats and bureaucracies on a scale that rivaled and in some ways surpassed Akkad. But the of that later glory was built in part on the back of a hard-learned lesson. Empire in the south had to be an empire of canals. The people who lived through these centuries did not speak about environmental degradation or salinization curves. They spoke about cursed fields, angry gods, unjust officials, merciful kings. Underneath those words, though, you can trace the pattern. Irrigation brought abundance and cities. Abundance supported complex administration. Complex administration allowed more ambitious irrigation. Each turn of that spiral made southern Mesopotamian society richer, more populous, and more tightly dependent on a fragile balance of water and salt. When that balance was disturbed by shifts in river flow, by political fragmentation that hampered large-scale canal maintenance, by generations of slow salt build-up, the results were not a single dramatic fall into empty desert. They were patchworks of adjustment, conflict, improvisation, and in some places, quiet failure. Fields did not turn white overnight. Families did not all leave at once. Some held on, shifted crops, took temple rations, worked more days of corvée. Others sold land, moved downstream, enlisted under new rulers who promised better management. Some cities shrank, others rose on neighbouring mounds. Seen in this light, collapse in Sumer looks less like a cliff and more like a series of terraces, each one a different compromise between people, water, and soil. That pattern, long-term environmental stress intersecting with political choices, was not unique to Mesopotamia. As the 4.2K event rippled outward, other great river civilizations were facing their own tests of resilience. Further west, along the Nile, pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were discovering that even the mightier stone pyramids could not guarantee steady floods. If you sailed west from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia and somehow could keep going, past deserts and coastlines and ridges of rock, you would eventually come to a very different kind of river world. The Nile is not a network of canals painstakingly cut into flat mud. It is a spine, a single long green ribbon running through brown rock. From the air, if you could have seen it back then, Egypt would look like a black strip of cultivation hugging both banks of the river, only a few kilometres wide in most places, with the desert pressing in on either side like an ocean of sand. Almost no rain, almost no trees, life clinging to the line of water. For centuries before 2200 BC, that line had been stable enough that an entire political theology had grown around it. In Old Kingdom Egypt, the king was not just a ruler. He was the pivot between heaven, Nile, and land. The floods came each year in a rough rhythm. Snowmelt and rain in the Ethiopian highlands and equatorial regions swelled the river. The water rose in summer, peaked, then slowly receded in autumn, leaving behind wet, dark silt that could be planted with barley, emmer, flax, and vegetables. When the system worked, it was simple in principle, a predictable natural pulse, harnessed by a strong central state. Royal officials measured inundation levels with nilometers, stone stairways and shafts cut into the riverbank. Scribes recorded the height of the flood. From those measurements, they projected how much land could be sown, how big the harvest might be, how much tax could be demanded. Out in the countryside, local communities used basins and dikes to manage the water, low embankments that trapped floodwater in shallow fields, letting it soak in before being drained to the next level. This did not require the same kind of year-round canal labour as in Mesopotamia, but it did require coordination. Dikes had to be raised at the right time, breaches repaired, silt cleared. The Old Kingdom state, with its capital at Memphis, was very good at this kind of coordination. It developed one of the most centralised bureaucracies in early history. The king at the top, then viziers, provincial governors, inspectors, scribes, overseers of granaries, overseers of fields, overseers of labour crews, orders flowing downward, taxes and reports flowing upward. That machinery fed more than just people. It fed stone. The pyramids at Giza, built in the 4th dynasty, are the most famous expressions of Old Kingdom power. But they were only the most visible peaks of a whole mountain range of construction. Valley temples, causeways, subsidiary pyramids, mastaba tombs for nobles, storage complexes, sun temples, royal estates. To build those, the state mobilized seasonal labor on a massive scale. Peasants who were not needed on their fields during the flood season could be drafted to haul limestone blocks, bake bricks, quarry granite, transport provisions. In exchange, they received rations, grain, beer, oil, organized down to the jar. From the royal point of view, this was a harmonious system. The king performs rituals to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order. The gods bless the Nile with good floods. Good floods support good harvests. Good harvests support pyramids and offerings. Pyramids and offerings glorify the king and please the gods. The circle closes. For a long time, it seemed to work. By the 5th and 6th dynasties, the Old Kingdom had stretched its reach far south into Nubia, east into the Sinai, west into some oases. Expeditions brought back copper, gold, timber, incense, exotic animals. Tomb reliefs show orderly processions of officials, scribes counting cattle, craftsmen at their benches. Yet even in these images of abundance you can trace hints of strain. Over time the royal family granted more titles and more land to local elites. Provincial governors, the officials we call nomarchs, from the later Greek word for district, grew in wealth and importance. Funerary chapels in the provinces became larger and more elaborate. Inscriptions began to boast not just of loyalty to the king, but of local achievements. I built this canal. I fed this town in famine. I judged fairly between the poor and the powerful. The centre of gravity was shifting slowly as generations of kings tried to hold together a long, narrow country with a complicated flow of goods and obligations up and down the river. Then, sometime toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, that smooth rhythm faltered. Around 2200 BC, the Nile floods seem to have become less reliable for a period of years or decades. Not necessarily a single apocalyptic failure, but a pattern of lower-than-average inundations, interrupted by occasional normal or high years. We know this not from direct water measurements, that kind of record only appears much later, but from several lines of indirect evidence. Sediment cores taken from ancient Nile channels and nearby lakes show changes in the size and composition of particles deposited around this time, suggestive of reduced flood energy. Pollen records hint at shifts in vegetation zones along the river and in the eastern Mediterranean. In the broader region, other proxies, dead sea levels, stalagmites, marine cores, signal a drying trend. Most evocatively, later Egyptian texts look back on a period of terrible low floods and social unrest. The so-called admonitions of Ippur, copied in a much later manuscript, paints a picture of inverted order. The rich are poor, the poor are rich, the river is blood, foreigners are everywhere, the land is in chaos. Another text, the Prophecy of Neferti, describes a time when the river of Egypt is empty, and people cross the water on foot. These documents are literary, full of exaggeration and symbolic language. They were composed or recopied centuries later for their own purposes. We cannot read them as simple eyewitness reports, but they suggest that in Egyptian cultural memory there was a phase when the Nile did not behave as it should, and when political order frayed. Imagine what even a modest run of bad floods would mean inside that carefully balanced Old Kingdom system. A low inundation means less land properly soaked and fertilized. Farmers sow on dry or marginal ground. Harvests shrink. The royal bureaucracy, however, is still there. Pyramids and mortuary temples are still operating. Palace staff, priests, overseers, scribes, soldiers, all expect rations. The king is still expected to sponsor offerings on a monumental scale for his divine ancestors. To maintain that apparatus, taxes in kind, grain, linen, livestock have to be collected. If you're a peasant in a village along the Nile and the flood has been poor, the tax collector's arrival becomes a heavier event. In a good year, turning over a proportion of your surplus might feel like part of the cosmic order. In a bad year, when your family faces hunger, the same demand can tip you into desperation. Local officials are squeezed as well. They have quotas to send up the chain. So many sacks to the regional granary. So much beef for the royal residents. If their own districts have suffered, they can try to negotiate lower assessments, but the centre has its own obligations. Under that kind of pressure, some nomarchs may have chosen to prioritise their own people, hoarding local grain, redirecting deliveries, or simply failing to fulfil central demands. Others might have leaned harder on their villages, provoking unrest or flight. Over a few cycles of poor flood and tense redistribution, the old trust between centre and periphery can erode. At the same time, the Old Kingdom state had become expensive in another way: administration itself. By the 6th dynasty, titles were proliferating. Tomb inscriptions mention layer upon layer of overseers and scribes. Royal family members held high offices, but so did powerful provincial families. Functions that had once been tightly controlled from Memphis were now partly in local hands. This worked as long as everyone accepted the central myth, that the king's divinely guaranteed mayat underpinned the entire system. When floods faltered, that myth became harder to sustain. The long reign of Pepi II, traditionally said to have ruled more than 90 years, sits at the end of the Old Kingdom. Whether or not that number is accurate, he did rule for decades. A very old king, on the throne since childhood, surrounded by generations of officials whose careers rose and fell while he remained the nominal pivot of the world. When he finally died, succession may not have been straightforward. Short-lived kings followed. Genealogies become confusing. Royal names are poorly attested. The neat, long dynastic sequences of earlier times give way to a blur. This is the moment when historians usually say the Old Kingdom ends and the First Intermediate Period begins. On the ground, for people living along the Nile, it probably did not feel like a sudden civilizational collapse. There was no point at which the last pyramid worker went home, the last priest snuffed out the last incense, and everyone agreed that an era was over. Instead, political unity frayed. Provincial governors began to rule more like little kings in their own nomes. In Upper Egypt, cities like Heracleopolis and Thebes emerged as rival centres, claiming to speak for the whole land. Local tombs from this time show nomarchs boasting of feeding their districts during shortages, defending their borders, building their own small pyramidal chapels. The imagery of power changed subtly. Instead of a single king towering above others, you see a landscape of regional strongmen, each anchored in their stretch of river. Yet culture did not vanish. The language on tomb walls is still recognizably Egyptian. People still mummify their dead. If anything, mummy techniques and coffin decoration become more widespread outside the royal court. Local temples still invoke Ra, Osiris, Hathor. Scribes still copy older texts, adapt them, compose new ones. In art, the stiff, idealized forms of earlier royal workshops give way to more varied provincial styles. Some reliefs from First Intermediate Period tombs show vivid scenes of daily life, more expressive faces. The script develops regional quirks. In other words, what collapsed was not Egyptian civilization, but a particular model of how it was organized. The strong central pharaonic state of the Old Kingdom, anchored in Memphis and funded by highly centralized taxation and labor mobilization, could not easily absorb a prolonged period of Nile variability, rising administrative costs, and intense competition among elites. When that structure loosened, power seeped into the gaps. Nomarchs who could successfully shepherd their people through lean years gained prestige. Those who mismanaged or overexploited their districts lost followers. Some areas likely suffered badly. Archaeology shows abandonment or contraction of certain sites, evidence of poorer burials, less monumental building. Other regions appear surprisingly resilient, maintaining or even increasing local prosperity under autonomous rulers. Later, when a new line of kings from Thebes reunified the country and founded the Middle Kingdom, they looked back on the First Intermediate Period as a shameful time of division and suffering. Their inscriptions describe it as an age when no king ruled, when every man was a law unto himself. But those same reunited kings also inherited administrative practices, regional loyalties, and cultural forms that had evolved during the so-called chaos. They learned from the experiment in decentralization. The idea that Egypt somehow fell around 2200 BC into darkness is too simple. The Nile still flowed, even if not always as generously as before. Fields were still sown and harvested. Children were still named after gods. Stories were still told about the great pyramid builders of old. The memory of order persisted, even as new kinds of order were being improvised at smaller scales. Across the ancient world, this is a recurring pattern. Under environmental and political stress, empires and kingdoms crack along their fault lines. Central symbols lose some of their power. Local actors step forward. Life rearranges itself not into emptiness, but into a different mosaic. While Egypt was feeling those shifts along its narrow river corridor, another great river civilization far to the east was undergoing changes of its own. Changes that look, at first glance, nothing like collapse at all, and yet may have been shaped by the same broad winds of climate and connection. If Egypt is a narrow corridor of green pressed between deserts, the Indus world is almost the opposite. Think of a broad, low bowl sloping gently from the foothills of the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush down to the Arabian Sea. Instead of one dominant river, there is a braided fan of watercourses, the Indus itself, fed by snowmelt and mountain rain, and to the east a complex of rivers that ancient texts later call the Sarasvati or Gagahakra. Seasonal monsoon rains sweep in from the ocean, pouring water onto plains that can be lush in one decade, dangerously dry in another. It is in this environment that one of the most quietly impressive civilizations of the Bronze Age took shape. We call it the Indus, or Harappan, after one of its first excavated cities. Around the time when pyramids were still relatively new in Egypt and Sumerian scribes were inventing literature, people in this northwest corner of South Asia were building something different. Cities without obvious kings. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi. These names, pulled from modern maps, stand over the buried bones of places that were carefully, almost obsessively planned. Gridded streets running roughly north-south and east-west. Drainage systems that carried sewage away from houses into covered brick channels. Standardized baked bricks, mostly in the same ratio, about 1:2:4, whether you pick them up in Pakistan, northwest India, or the fringes of what is now Afghanistan. In some neighborhoods, rows of small workshops, beadmakers drilling impossibly fine perforations in hard stone, metalworkers melting copper and bronze in crucibles, potters throwing wheel-made vessels with a distinctive red slip and black-painted designs. In others, large multi-room houses with internal courtyards, wells, and bathing platforms. At Mohenjo-daro, there is the famous Great Bath, a carefully waterproofed pool set within a walled complex, fed by its own well, drained by its own outlet. Not a temple in the Mesopotamian sense, not a palace as we recognize them from Egypt, but a public space whose exact purpose we still argue about. There are seals, hundreds of them, from across the Indus zone. Small carved pieces of steatite fired to a glossy finish, showing animals, unicorn-like creatures, bulls with curving horns, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers. Above the animals, short sequences of tiny signs, the same set of symbols appearing again and again in different combinations. Whatever those signs meant, they were part of a shared script. Whatever those animals signalled, they were part of a shared symbolic world. And there was trade. Indus weights and measures follow a consistent series. Beads made in Indus workshops, especially of a banded stone called carnelian, turn up in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian texts speak of a distant place called Meluha, reached by sea, that sends wood, stone, metals, and exotic goods. In the Gulf, harbours like those at modern-day Oman show Indus-style pottery and seals. To the north, Indus materials creep into highland valleys, brushing up against routes that lead towards Central Asia. So, on the eve of 2200 BC, give or take a century or two because the dates in this region are fuzzier than in Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus civilization is a web of cities and towns stretched along rivers and old riverbeds, stitched together by trade, bound by shared material habits, but without the monumental tombs and royal inscriptions that proclaim individual rulers elsewhere. That absence shapes how we tell its story. In Egypt, you can follow kings by name. In Mesopotamia, dynasties announce their victories on stone. In the Indus, the script remains undeciphered. The signs are short, often only a handful at a time. There are no long historical annals, no obvious royal hymns. We do not know what they called their cities, their gods, their leaders, even themselves. When we talk about collapse or change in this world, we are not reading it from their words. We are inferring it from bricks and bones, pollen grains, river sediments, and the ghostly outlines of streets under farmers' fields. That makes the Indus case feel different. There is no recorded panic, no lamentation text like those from later Mesopotamia, no Egyptian prophecy looking back on famine. There is only a pattern in the dirt. Around the late 3rd millennium BC, the big planned cities begin to change. At Mohenjo-daro, upper layers show signs of rebuilding that is less careful. Some major drains are blocked or narrowed. Houses are subdivided. Walls are reused in ways the original planners probably did not intend. Kiln-fired bricks gradually give way in some places to more casual construction. The highest levels are eroded and disturbed, making fine-grained reconstruction difficult. But the general impression is of a city being lived in, modified, repaired, and eventually not maintained to the same standard. At Harappa, similar stories: shifting use of space, abandoned quarters, new buildings that do not follow the old grid so precisely. In other sites, the pattern is simpler. They are just not occupied anymore. Meanwhile, thousands of smaller settlements appear or expand in regions that had been more thinly populated before, especially toward the east, in the upper Ganges-Yamuna plains, and toward the foothills. Archaeologists talk here not so much about a dramatic fall as about deurbanization. The idea is that the civilization's distinctive urban centers, gradually lost population and importance, while people moved into smaller, more dispersed communities. Long-distance trade slackened. The standardized seals and weights appear less often. Fancy craft production becomes rarer or shifts to different materials. But pottery traditions, some building techniques, and certain styles of ornaments continue, adapted to new circumstances. Why would a network of thriving, well-drained, well-built cities quietly thin out like this? One cluster of answers looks up at the sky and out at the rivers. The Indus world is deeply entangled with the South Asian monsoon system and with glacier-fed rivers. Around the time of the 4.2K event, this broad, multi-regional signal of climate instability, several environmental proxies from northwest India and Pakistan begin to show shifts. Cores drilled in old lake beds and offshore sediments record changes in the isotopic signature of rainwater, consistent with a weakening or reorganization of the summer monsoon. Soil profiles suggest that some areas became drier overall, with more seasonal, less reliable rainfall. At the same time, the great river system itself was not fixed. The Gagahakra, often proposed as the geological counterpart of the later Sarasvati, seems to have lost some of its perennial Himalayan sources, becoming more seasonal even before the peak urban phase, then progressively less dependable. Some channels silted up, others migrated sideways. In low-lying zones, small shifts in gradient or discharge could turn well-watered fields into swamp, or, conversely, leave canals and wells suddenly too far from a shrinking stream. The picture that emerges is not of a single, catastrophic drought wiping everything clean, but of a decades-long, perhaps centuries-long rebalancing of water. Some regions may have suffered repeated crop failures when monsoon rains faltered or retreated. Others faced new flooding patterns as rivers jumped their banks or cut new courses. A city built carefully beside a stable channel might find itself next to a marsh or a dry bed within a few generations. In a society so attuned to both flood and rain, those changes would bite deeply. Large cities concentrate risk. They require regular inflows of grain, fuel, and clean water. Their drainage systems work only when maintained. If harvests around a city become less certain, if wells begin to fail or drains back up in unexpected flood events, the balance that made dense urban living attractive can tip. Layer onto this a second cluster of issues: health and economy. Dense populations sharing water and waste create fertile ground for disease. We know this from later cities, and while direct evidence from the Indus is limited, human remains show some signs of stress. Lesions on bones that hint at infections, indicators of childhood malnutrition in some cemeteries. If monsoon patterns became more erratic, alternating between drought and intense rain, that would favour both crop diseases and human epidemics. Periods of scarcity followed by wet seasons can promote waterborne illnesses and pests that flourish in standing water. Meanwhile, the long-distance trade that had linked the Indus to Mesopotamia and the Gulf appears to wobble. Around 2200 BC, Mesopotamia itself goes through the strains of the Akkadian crisis and its aftermath. Demand for imported goods may have declined. Maritime routes along the Arabian Sea and into the Gulf could have been disrupted by political instability at both ends. If merchants bringing copper from Oman, or timber from the highlands, or finished beads and textiles to Mesopotamian ports found fewer buyers, the economic rationale for large specialized workshops in places like Mohenjo-Daro weakens. Resources at home might also have been under pressure. Fuel to fire kilns and smelt metal had to come from trees and shrubs. Over time, the hinterlands of big cities can become deforested, forcing people to travel farther for wood, raising costs. Agricultural lands repeatedly cultivated without enough fallow or fertilizer can lose productivity. In a society without obvious centralized palaces or kings to enforce massive redistribution, local communities could respond by choosing to shrink their urban footprints, to move closer to still reliable water sources, to reorganize production at smaller scales. None of this requires a dramatic sack or burning of the great cities. In fact, widespread destruction layers, the signature of invading armies or sudden cataclysm, are rare. There are localized fires, collapsed walls, signs of hurried repair, but nothing that screams of a single day or year when Harappa fell. Instead, the archaeology suggests overlapping processes, some neighborhoods abandoned early, others lingering, craft traditions persisting in reduced form, certain regions declining while others grow. Timelines here are fuzzy. Radiocarbon dates come with error ranges of decades or more. Different sites seem to change at slightly different times and not always in the same direction. Some scholars see a relatively sharp transition from mature Harappan urban life to late Harappan village-based cultures over a century or two. Others argue for a more staggered, regionally varied picture, urban fluorescence starting to wane in some areas before 2200 BC, staying robust in others past 2000 BC, with climate shifts, river changes, and social decisions all weaving together. There is room for debate about emphasis. Are monsoon weakening and river avulsion the primary drivers, with society responding as best it can? Or were internal dynamics, changing trade patterns, social tensions, evolving religious practices, already pushing people toward new ways of living, with environmental stress serving as a final nudge? The evidence can be read in multiple ways, and different research teams do just that. What we can say, with some confidence, is that the Indus story does not fit a simple template of empire rises, empire collapses. There is no final Harappan king whose name we know, no last stand against barbarians recorded in stone. Instead, we see a slow, quiet rearrangement. Big rectilinear cities fade. Smaller, more scattered communities take their place, often in landscapes where rainfall patterns are slightly different, where rivers run in new channels, where crops and pottery styles slowly evolve. Some elements of the old world endure. Bead-making skills carry on in new settings. Certain motifs on pottery and ornaments echo earlier designs. People keep living in this region continuously. There is no emptying of the land. Later cultures, Vedic, early historic, layer new languages and beliefs over those plains. But beneath them, archaeologists still trace threads that run back into the Harappan age. So when we ask what happened to the Indus civilization around the time other parts of the ancient world were shaken, the answer is both simple and unsettling. It did not fall in a single year or even a single lifetime. It changed its shape. Under the combined weight of shifting monsoons, wandering rivers, health stresses, resource pressures, and perhaps distant economic shocks, the great cities loosened their grip. People stepped sideways, into smaller places, different patterns, new compromises with the land and sky. While brick by brick the Indus cities were thinning out, further west another region, the band of lands between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, was feeling its own version of strain. There the story would not be one of quiet deurbanization, but of royal letters, ruined palaces and cities caught between drought and war. If you look at a map of the ancient Near East, this region is the hinge. To the southwest, Egypt and the Nile. To the east, the twin rivers of Mesopotamia. To the north and northwest, the mountains and metals of Anatolia. Between them runs a band of steppe and fertile plains, of caravan tracks and river valleys, Syria and the Levant. In the 3rd millennium BC, this was not an empty corridor people hurried through. It was crowded with its own cities and kingdoms, Ebla in northwestern Syria, tucked near the edge of the steppe, Mari on the middle Euphrates, smaller centres like Nagar, Tutul, and dozens of town sites that today are just low mounds on the landscape. These places lived on a knife edge between rain-fed fields and dry pasture, between local harvests and long-distance trade. When the wider climate system began to wobble around 2200 BC, the tremors here were amplified. Think about their basic problem. Unlike Egypt, they did not have a single predictable flood to anchor their agriculture. Unlike southern Mesopotamia, they could not rely on vast canal networks pulling water from snow-fed rivers far away. Much of northern Syria and the Levant sat in a zone where farmers looked anxiously at the sky every winter and spring. If enough rain came, fields of wheat and barley would ripen on the rolling plains. If rains faltered or shifted a little north or south, those same fields might wither. A city like Ebla drew grain, wool and oil from hundreds of small villages scattered across that rainfall gradient. Good years and bad years were baked into the system. Layered onto that was another balancing act, the relationship between settled farmers and mobile pastoralists. Beyond the ploughed fields stretched steppe and semi-desert, home to herders moving flocks of sheep, goats, maybe cattle and donkeys, along seasonal grazing routes. In stable times, there were treaties and gift exchanges, marriage ties and protection pacts. The city got animals, wool and guarding of caravan routes. Pastoral groups got grain, manufactured goods, and access to wells and markets. But if pastures dried or crops failed, that partnership could strain. Herders might push closer to sown fields, villagers might fence off water sources, raiding could spike, and the city's rulers would be forced to choose between negotiation and force. Add one more dependency: trade. The tablets from Ebla and Mari, when you read the translations, are full of movement. Copper and tin from the north and east, timber from the mountains, wool and textiles, lapis lazuli travelling ultimately from Afghanistan, gold and silver from Anatolia or beyond. Caravans loaded with goods, envoys moving between courts, donkeys trudging along dusty tracks. Cities in this corridor were like toll booths and warehouses combined. Their wealth came not only from the fields immediately around them, but from their ability to tax, protect, and redistribute goods coming from far away. If any of these pillars wobbled, rainfall, pastoral balance, or trade, the whole structure could shake. Around the time of the 4.2K event, all three seem to have come under stress. Archaeologists see it first in the dirt. At Tel Mardik, ancient Ebla, there is a destruction layer, a stratum of rubble and ash where once there were carefully laid palatial rooms packed with tablets. Smashed jars, collapsed walls, charred beams. For a long time, this burning was linked in popular accounts to the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, marching west and levelling the city around 2250 to 2200 BC. The story is neat. Expanding Mesopotamian empire collides with Syrian city-state, wins, and leaves a smoking ruin. But as more sites have been dug, the picture has blurred. Some destruction layers in the region cluster roughly around this late 3rd millennium window, but they do not all line up precisely. At some mounds, you see signs of violent burning. At others, abandonment without obvious fire. Some places contract to smaller, more defensible footprints. Others shift their main occupation from low plains to hilltops or tell summits. The changes are real, but they are not all the same. Take Mari. This city perched on a bend of the Euphrates, controlling a crossing point and river traffic. In earlier centuries it had been a planned canal-linked town with a palace, temples, and warehouses. Around the end of the 3rd millennium, its fortunes flicker. There are phases of interruption, rebuilding, and eventually, in the centuries that follow, a rise to new prominence under different dynasties. Mari does not simply disappear. It adapts, realigns itself with shifting political forces upriver and downriver. The collapse here is a series of jolts and reconfigurations, not a single fatal blow. If you zoom out to the whole region, settlement patterns tell a similar story. Surveys that map where people were living in different periods, by counting pottery on the surface, tracing buried walls, or combining old excavation reports, show that in some inland plains of northern Syria, the density of sites peaks in the mid-3rd millennium, then drops sharply after about 2200 BC. Large sites shrink. Some medium-sized towns vanish. In contrast, certain coastal and upland zones seem to fare better, or even grow, perhaps because they had slightly more reliable moisture, or could tap different kinds of resources. What could push this kind of rearrangement? Climate records from nearby, lake cores, cave stalagmites, marine sediments, suggest that the wider eastern Mediterranean and northern Mesopotamian region experienced a period of drier, more variable conditions around this time. Not a permanent shift to desert, but enough of a downturn in average rainfall, with more frequent drought years, to make marginal farmland precarious. For a rain-fed city-state system already playing close to the edge, that matters. In bad years, farmers on the driest edges might pack up and move, either toward rivers, towards cities, or out into the steppe with relatives among pastoral groups. Villages that had been viable for generations could be abandoned within a couple of seasons if the wells failed or crops repeatedly failed. From the city's perspective, this looks like a shrinking tax base, fewer surplus stores, more people showing up at the gates needing grain. At the same time, pastoral groups would have been squeezed. Less rain on the steppe means poorer grazing. Herders might bring their flocks into sown lands earlier in the year, or in larger numbers, or seek new agreements with different cities. Some might turn to raiding if negotiations failed. To rulers in places like Ebla or Nagar, this could feel like pressure from both sides, emptying villages and increasingly assertive tribes on the frontier. The tablets from slightly later centuries, at Mari and elsewhere, are full of letters obsessing over the loyalty and movement of pastoral groups, trying to track who is camped where, who has crossed which river. It is not hard to imagine that something similar was already brewing in the time of the 4.2K event. Migration and mobility in this context are not just background noise, They are political actors, a group that moves its tents, its animals, and a few thousand people from one river basin to another can tip the balance of power. A city that opens its gates to displaced farmers and herders might bolster its army and workforce, but strain its granaries. A city that refuses them might face raids, or simply watch its hinterland empty as people vote with their feet. Trade routes, too, do not stand still in a crisis. Caravans are conservative in one sense. They follow known water sources and safe passes, but they are also opportunistic. If a once reliable city is burned or bankrupt, merchants will seek another. If banditry rises on one track, kings might invest in making another safer, garrisoning wells, fortifying way stations, guaranteeing passage in exchange for tolls. This is what some historians mean when they talk about securitization of trade. In hard times, moving goods becomes a more militarized, tightly managed affair. The delicate thing underneath all this is trust. When a merchant sends a shipment of copper from the mountains near Anatolia, through Syrian cities, toward Mesopotamia, he often is not travelling the whole way himself. He relies on local agents, on scribes to record debts, on rulers to honour treaties and promises. Palaces issue tablets acknowledging receipt, promising repayment in grain, silver or other goods. It is a web of credit and administrative confidence. Now imagine a sequence of drought years. Grain prices spike, cities draw down their reserves, rulers might decide to default on certain obligations, delay a delivery, seize a caravan in lieu of tax, or simply fail to protect merchants on their roads. Neighbouring kings notice. Suddenly the old assurances mean less. A trader thinks twice before trusting a seal from a palace that might be sacked next year. A distant partner wonders if that warehouse in Ebla is still standing. When enough of these small calculations tip toward caution, the flow of goods can seize up. Not everywhere, not forever, but enough that certain cities, especially those whose power is built more on intermediation than on a strong local food base, find themselves cut off. A place like Ebla, whose archives show a complex diplomatic and commercial network stretching from Mesopotamia to the Levantine coast, is particularly vulnerable. If caravans reroute through rival towns, if coastal ports start dealing directly with Mesopotamian clients, Ebla's leverage erodes even before any army shows up at its walls. All of this is happening in a region already entangled with Mesopotamia's own troubles. The Akkadian Empire, which had pushed west and claimed hegemony over parts of Syria, begins to fragment under its own mix of environmental stress, internal rebellion, and shifting leadership. As Akkadian garrisons withdraw or lose strength, local kings in Syria and the Levant gain room to maneuver, but they also lose a large, if sometimes resented, partner in maintaining order along key routes. A bad harvest that once could be cushioned by shipments from the imperial heartland might now be faced alone. It is tempting to compress this into a simple story. Climate dries, cities fall. But when you trace the individual strands, the picture is more nuanced. Some sites in the region show clear late 3rd millennium destruction, then a long gap before reoccupation. Others seem to continue, perhaps at reduced scale, perhaps under new dynasties, weaving themselves into the emerging political map of the early 2nd millennium. Coastal cities may have leaned more on maritime links when inland routes faltered. Upland communities with access to springs and resilient terraces could become new poles of stability as lowland plains thinned. There is regional variation at every step. Northern inland plains look different from the wetter Levantine coast. The upper Euphrates basin has its own rhythm, not identical to that of the interior steppe. In some areas, the 4.2K event seems to coincide with sharp settlement decline. In others, the archaeological signal is softer, a reorganization rather than a crash. What ties these different stories together is not a single moment of apocalypse, but a shared experience of strain transmitted through networks. Drought in one river basin can push herders into a neighbouring one. The fall of a palace in Syria can disrupt trade arrangements in southern Mesopotamia. A caravan rerouting away from one city can buoy another. The shockwaves of scarcity ripple along the connective tissue. While the Indus world was quietly redistributing itself into smaller towns and villages, the cities of Syria and the Levant were being forced into more abrupt choices: fight, fortify, migrate, renegotiate. Some would not survive in recognizable form. Others, bruised and reshaped, would emerge as key players in the next chapter of Near Eastern history, as Amorite dynasties and new trading systems took hold. Beyond them, to the north and east, Yet another set of landscapes was responding to the same broad climate pulse in its own way. The highlands of Anatolia, the rugged Caucasus, the plateau of Iran. There, the story would involve metals, mountain passes, and new frontiers of power. If Syria and the Levant were the hinge between river kingdoms, the lands beyond them were the hinges of a larger machine. To the northwest, the Anatolian highlands. To the northeast, the knot of ridges and valleys we call the Caucasus. To the east and southeast, the Iranian plateau and its surrounding mountains. On a modern map, these are separate regions with their own histories. Around 2200 BC, they were parts of one extended problem. How do you move things and people through mountains? From the perspective of Egypt or southern Mesopotamia, these highlands mattered less for what they grew and more for what they hid inside their rocks and forests. Copper in Anatolia and the Caucasus, silver and gold in eastern Anatolia and western Iran, bitumen, stone, semi-precious gems. Later, iron would take centre stage here, but in the 3rd millennium BC it was still mostly about copper and its precious alloy, bronze. Think of a bronze axe in an Akkadian soldier's hand, or a ceremonial dagger in an Egyptian noble's tomb. The metal in those blades almost certainly did not come from the flat river valleys where they were used. It had been dug out of some hillside gallery hundreds of kilometres away, smelted near the mine mouth or in a nearby town, then packed onto the backs of donkeys and sent down some winding route toward the lowlands. Those routes needed more than geography. They needed agreements, with local chiefs near the mines, with towns along the way, with herders who knew where the summer waterholes still flowed. They needed a certain level of peace, or at least predictable violence. Banditry you can budget for. Uncontrolled warfare you cannot. In the 3rd millennium BC, we glimpse some of this world at the edges of our sources. Mesopotamian texts talk about campaigns into the mountains of Subatu and beyond, about copper and timber coming from the land of the cedar and further. Later Hittite and Assyrian records will name specific passes and mining districts in Anatolia and the Zagros, but by 2200 BC, it is still a bit of a blur. What we can say is that these uplands supplied 3 things the great river empires depended on: metals, wood, and animals. Metals first. Copper came out of places like the Taurus Mountains of southern Anatolia, the Pontic Range to the north, the Caucasus, and the Iranian interior. Tin, the rarer additive that makes bronze harder and more workable, likely came from even more distant zones, perhaps eastern Anatolia, the Zagros, or as far as Central Asia. The exact sources are debated, but the pattern is not. The lowland cities that flourished on grain and irrigation were also wired into long chains, reaching deep into mountain territory, then timber. Egypt had almost no good building wood of its own. Southern Mesopotamia had reeds and palm trunks, but not tall straight beams for roofs and ships. The mountains to the north and northwest had cedar, juniper, oak. Cutting those trees and dragging them downriver or overland became a specialized frontier economy. Control of a forested valley could translate directly into leverage over temple and palace projects hundreds of kilometers away. And animals. The uplands and steppe margins of Anatolia and Iran supported herds of cattle, sheep, goats, and crucially equids, donkeys, and by this time probably the first domestic horses filtering in from the Eurasian steppe. Donkeys were already the backbone of Near Eastern caravans. Horses, once integrated into local economies, would eventually revolutionize warfare and long-distance communication. Around 2200 BC, they are just starting to appear in the archaeological record in these zones, another sign that the mountains are not peripheral, they are laboratories of change. All of this made the highlands valuable. It also made them fragile in a different way than the rain-fed plains of Syria. A mine does not work like a field. You cannot just walk away for a season and come back to the same soil. Galleries collapse. Underground water seeps in. Smelters require steady supplies of charcoal, which in turn requires systematic cutting of local forests. To run a mining district safely, you need organization. To feed miners, to maintain access tracks, to guard shipments, to mediate disputes with nearby communities whose grazing and sacred sites you might be disturbing. When an empire like Akkad was strong, it could project power into these highlands, establish garrisons, demand tribute of copper ingots and timber, send overseers. When that imperial grip loosened, the effects rippled unevenly. Imagine a caravan path that has been under the shadow of an imperial standard for a century. Local bandits know there are patrols. Local chiefs receive gifts and recognition in exchange for keeping the peace. Merchants factor predictable tolls and small losses into their calculations, but overall, the route is safe enough. Now imagine those garrisons unpaid after a series of bad harvests, or recalled to deal with rebellions closer to home. The same path suddenly becomes more negotiable. A local lord might set up his own toll station and double the fees. A disgruntled clan might decide that raiding caravans is more profitable than herding. Merchants hesitate. Some reroute, some stop entirely. From the lowland perspective, this shows up not as an obvious collapse of a mine, but as shortages, delays, price spikes. Copper shipments are smaller, less regular. Palaces revise their building plans, postpone projects, recycle old metal. The great long-distance exchange system that had fed cities with exotic goods begins to creak. These breakdowns did not happen in a single instant everywhere, and in the highlands they intersected with something else, climatic diversity. One of the reasons the 4.2K event is so hard to pin down is that it did not play out identically in all environments. A low plateau with winter snow and spring melt responds differently to a rainfall downturn than a marginal steppe plain does. A south-facing valley with perennial springs might be buffered while a north-facing slope dries. The Anatolian interior, for example, is a patchwork of basins and uplands. Some lake and cave records from central Anatolia suggest drier conditions around this time, but the signal is not uniformly catastrophic. Parts of the plateau show evidence of continued occupation, even growth, while certain marginal farming zones seem to thin out. In the Caucasus, glacial and pollen records hint at shifts in vegetation and temperature, but not a singular sudden crash. On the Iranian plateau, some valleys experience stress. Others, especially those tied to snow-fed rivers, might have remained relatively stable. This mosaic matters. A drought that devastates lowland rain-fed agriculture can simultaneously create opportunities in better watered upland pockets. As settlers leave failing villages on the steppe margins, they might move uphill along river corridors, into foothill zones with more reliable springs and cooler microclimates. At the same time, some mountain pastures might actually become more attractive if lower elevation land is overgrazed or exhausted. Archaeologists trace this through what they call settlement systems. In parts of western Iran, surveys show a shift in the late 3rd millennium from large, lowland sites to more dispersed, often higher elevation communities. In eastern Anatolia and the northern Zagros, there is evidence for new fortified hilltop sites, sometimes overlooking routes and passes. In the southern Caucasus, the transition from one pottery tradition to another, say, from Kura Araxes wares to later styles, is loosely contemporary with this broader 4.2K window, hinting at population movements or cultural reorientations. Pottery, in this context, is not just about aesthetics. A change in ceramic style, clay recipes, or firing techniques can signal new groups moving in, new trade links, or simply new tastes spreading along old networks. In highland Iran and the South Caucasus, the late 3rd millennium sees exactly this kind of turnover, one horizon of ceramics gradually giving way to another, accompanied by shifts in burial customs and architecture. Is that collapse, or is it transformation? In some mining zones, activity clearly declines. Slag heaps stop growing. Smelting sites are abandoned. In others, work continues or even intensifies, possibly under new management, local chiefs stepping into spaces once claimed by distant kings. A valley that used to ship copper to Mesopotamia might redirect it toward closer markets, or toward emerging centres in Anatolia and Iran itself. This is where conflict and opportunity blur. As the great lowland empires stumble, mountains can become refuges and launch pads at the same time. Think of a local strongman in an Anatolian valley around 2150 BC. He commands a few fortified villages, some access to copper or silver, maybe a stand of good timber. For a century he has been caught between bigger players, Akkadian officers demanding tribute from one side, rival highland chiefs pressing from another. When Akkad weakens, his burdens ease, but so do some of the benefits. Fewer imperial gifts, less guaranteed market for his products. He has choices. He can try to carve out a wider domain, seizing neighbouring valleys in the power vacuum. He can strike new deals with Syrian or Iranian polities still standing. He can close ranks, retreat to the most defensible hills, and ride out a period of uncertainty, investing less in long-distance trade and more in local subsistence. Across the region, different leaders chose different paths. Some hill forts from this era look large and ambitious, suggesting militarized polities trying to control key choke points. Others are small, scattered, almost like emergency refuges. Grave goods in some cemeteries get richer at precisely the moment lowland cities are struggling, hinting at elites in the mountains doing rather well out of the chaos below. What we are seeing here is not a neat toppling of an interconnected system, but a reconfiguration of its wiring. Long-distance routes that once ran in straightish lines from Tigris to Taurus, or from Nile to Levant to Zagros, become broken, kinked, rerouted. Some disappear. New ones form, linking highland communities more tightly to one another, perhaps at the expense of their older ties to lowland cores. For a scribe in southern Mesopotamia, this would feel like collapse. Shipments not arriving, prices rising, once reliable highland names vanishing from the records. For a miner's family in the Taurus, it might feel more like a dangerous but potentially profitable time. Old overlords gone, new patrons competing for their allegiance. Climate in this story is not a single hammer blow, but a background shift that changes which strategies work and which do not. Slightly drier conditions might push pastoralists to use higher summer pastures more intensively. That, in turn, could bring them into conflict with mining camps or forest cutters. Reduced snowpack in some years could make certain passes riskier in spring, forcing caravans onto alternative tracks and enriching the villages that control them. By the early 2nd millennium BC, out of this churn will emerge new political formations, more consolidated highland kingdoms in Anatolia, more clearly defined polities in western Iran, complex chiefdoms in the Caucasus. These will later intersect with rising powers like the old Hittite kingdom and the old Babylonian dynasties. But in the centuries around 2200 BC, they are still coalescing, their outlines blurry. When historians talk about a system collapse at this time, it can sound like everything stopped. In the mountains, almost the opposite happens. Things move, people, alliances, routes, even the metals themselves now flowing along different paths. What collapses is not human life, or even necessarily population in every valley. What collapses is a particular configuration of networks, a way of tying river basins to highlands through tribute, trade, and imperial oversight. Remove that under the pressure of droughts, shortages, and political overreach, and the whole map of connectivity redraws itself. Some nodes go dark, others light up. Frontier zones, like Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Iran, stop being quiet suppliers on the edge of someone else's world and start becoming worlds of their own. And as those worlds shift, the stress on the old centres increases. Fewer metals and timbers arriving, fewer donkeys laden with tin at the city gates, less certainty about who controls the passes, the wells, the mines. The mountain frontiers, in other words, are not a side story to the crises in Egypt and Mesopotamia. They are part of the same unfolding reorganisation. To see how deep that reorganisation ran, we have to follow the goods themselves, the copper, the tin, the timber, the textiles, as they stall, divert, and resume. Because when those flows buckle, cities that once felt solid can find their foundations quietly eroding beneath them. If you zoom out from any one mine, any one forested valley, what you see by the late 3rd millennium BC is not a scatter of isolated exchanges, but a web. Copper moving one way, tin another, grain flowing out from river basins, wool and finished textiles flowing in. Alongside them, less visible, but just as important, information, obligations, and people. Start with the metals, because in a Bronze Age world, bronze is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. A plough blade that makes deeper furrows in dry soil, rivets and fittings that hold ships together, tools for carpenters, masons and canal diggers, weapons for soldiers and guards and caravan escorts. To get bronze, you need copper and tin, and they almost never come from the same place. Southern Mesopotamia has neither in usable quantities. Egypt has a bit of copper in Sinai and the Eastern Desert, but almost no tin, so both regions are plugged into long thin lines reaching up into Anatolia, across Iran, possibly even further east towards Central Asia. Those metal streams are braided together with others. Textiles, for instance. The plains of northern Mesopotamia and western Iran are excellent sheep country. You can picture bales of wool and finished cloth moving down towards cities like Akkad, Ur, or Mari, where they become both garments and currency, temples and palaces paying workers in rations of grain and lengths of cloth. In the other direction comes food, grain from the rich alluvial fields of the Tigris and Euphrates, barley and emmer feeding not just city dwellers, but also garrisons at mountain passes, mining camps and logging crews in distant forests. When harvests are good, surplus grain can be shipped upriver or overland. When they are not, that cushion disappears. Then there are the things that make elites feel elite. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus, gold from Nubia, fine carved stone vessels, scented oils, rare woods. Each of these moves along overlapping routes, sometimes changing hands multiple times before ending up in a tomb or temple, and labour moves along with them. Craftspeople summoned from one region to another, seasonal workers drawn to large building projects, captives taken in raids and resettled as field hands or household servants. When an empire is strong, it can coordinate this flow, assign corvée labour to clear canals, redirect workers to fortify a border, concentrate artisans in particular districts. None of this works on trust alone. It needs systems. By 2200 BC, those systems are already impressive. In Mesopotamia, merchants use standardized weights, carefully shaped stones and metal pieces, calibrated so that a shekel in one city means roughly the same thing as a shekel in another. Egypt has its own measures, but the principle is similar, agreed upon units that turn a pile of goods into numbers you can tax, lend and repay. To protect shipments and signal ownership, traders and officials use seals. In Mesopotamia, the famous cylinder seals, little carved rollers that leave a continuous impression of gods, animals and symbols when pressed into wet clay. In Egypt and the Levant, stamp seals and scarabs. Press one into a clay stopper on a jar, or onto a lump of sealing clay around a cord, and you've created a tiny contract. This container, this door, this chest is closed under the authority of whoever owns that seal. Behind the scenes, scribes turn the whole system into writing. Clay tablets listing cargoes, loan agreements, partnerships between palace and merchant, receipts for deliveries of copper ingots, wool, barley, timber. When you read those tablets, you see a world that assumes continuity. Copper will arrive next season, grain will be harvested, debts will be paid with interest. This is how interdependence becomes invisible. When everything works, you don't think about the fact that the bronze chisel in a mason's hand depends on snowfall in some distant mountain, on peace along a caravan track, on scribes correctly recording last year's deliveries. When it stops working, the invisibility goes away. Imagine a series of dry years hitting the grain heartlands. Not absolute famine everywhere, but enough stress that surplus shrinks. Palaces prioritize feeding local soldiers and urban dependents. Grain shipments to faraway mines or logging camps are cut back, or priced higher. At the same time, political troubles ripple through the highlands. Garrisons withdrawn, as we saw, local chiefs asserting themselves. Caravan leaders now have to bargain more aggressively for safe passage, or pay higher tolls. Some decide not to risk it, others take longer, more circuitous routes. From the perspective of a metalworker in a city, what you see is this: copper prices creeping up, tin becoming harder to find, orders from temples slowing, or shifting from new tools to repair and recycle old ones. A few workshops close, others lay off apprentices. Scarcity rarely produces cooperation at large scales. More often, it produces hoarding. Palaces and big households start stockpiling whatever metal they can get, not in the form of finished goods, but as ingots, scrap, anything that can be remelted. Merchants with access to mountain sources sit on their stocks, waiting for prices to rise further. Negotiations become tenser. Credit arrangements that once assumed smooth flows now look risky. When margins get tight, some people turn from trade to predation. Caravan raiding, river piracy, opportunistic theft from warehouses. Banditry, of course, is as old as trade itself, but under stress the balance can tilt. A route that was safe enough when profits were fat becomes not worth it, when every lost donkey and every stolen ingot cuts into already thin gains. As fewer caravans move, specializations that depended on reliable imports wobble. A city quarter full of bronze smiths shrinks. Some families switch to repairing ploughs and household tools instead of producing elaborate ceremonial pieces. Luxury artisans, those who inlaid lapis or carved rare stones, find fewer clients. Workshops close. their spaces taken over by more mundane activities or left empty. Archaeologists see this not in one dramatic layer of burning, but in quieter shifts. Imported goods become rarer in excavated houses and tombs. The distinctive red carnelian beads from the Indus, the bright blue lapis, the particular shapes of foreign stone vessels, fewer of them show up in layers dating after around 2200 BC in many sites. Urban craft districts, once dense with kilns, slag and industrial debris, often contract. In some Mesopotamian and Syrian cities, late 3rd millennium levels show reduced evidence of large-scale metalworking or specialized luxury crafts. Pottery styles might simplify, production becoming more local and less standardized. Burials change too. In some regions, earlier graves of elites contain rich assortments of imported objects, metal weapons, finely worked ornaments. Later graves from the same cemeteries sometimes look plainer. Fewer foreign items, more locally made pottery, simpler jewellery. Wealth doesn't necessarily vanish, but it is expressed differently, drawing more on what can be sourced nearby. There are exceptions, of course. In some highland or frontier zones, grave wealth actually increases as local chiefs capitalise on new opportunities. But viewed across a wider map, the pattern of long-distance exotic goods thins. Meanwhile, in the palaces and councils where big decisions are made, a feedback loop is taking shape. Political instability disrupts trade. A succession struggle in a city-state leads to rival armies marching through the countryside, scaring merchants off key roads. A rebellion in a mining district cuts off supplies of copper or tin. A breakdown in central authority invites more local tolls and raids. Every uncertainty along the way makes merchants more cautious. But the disruption of trade also fuels political instability. A palace that suddenly finds its warehouses low on metal cannot keep arming its troops at the same rate. It struggles to reward allies with luxury gifts. Temple projects stall, leaving labourers unpaid or underpaid, breeding discontent. If grain shipments are also irregular, the urban poor feel the squeeze first. Leaders respond in different ways. Some try to clamp down, emergency levies, forced requisitioning of grain or metal, harsher control over merchants. In the short term, that might feed an army. In the long term, it drives traders away, undermines trust, and shrinks the very networks that once sustained the state. Others might loosen their grip, allowing more local autonomy in the hope that trade will revive. But that too has costs. Provincial governors and local strongmen start acting like independent rulers, keeping more of the surplus for themselves. The more the centre relies on them, the more leverage they gain, and the less incentive they have to send scarce resources downriver. The result, across the Near East and beyond, is not a uniform crash, but a series of entangled stumbles. An Akkadian governor losing control of a copper route here. An Egyptian official finding his shipments of Levantine timber delayed there. A merchant from the Indus arriving to find his usual partners bankrupt or replaced. From our vantage point 3,000 or 4,000 years later, when we line up the evidence from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, the Indus world, Anatolia, Iran, it can look eerie. Many regions show stress or transformation within a few centuries of each other. Dynasties fall, urban systems reorganize, imported luxuries become scarce. It is tempting to imagine a single blow, a collapse year when everything snapped at once. The reality is probably messier. Local droughts, regional conflicts, internal political choices, all feeding into shared networks that carried metals, grain, ideas, and risk. Because that is the dark side of interdependence. The same connections that let a drought in one valley be cushioned by imports from another can, under certain conditions, transmit stress instead of relief. A shortage in one crucial node, tin, for example, or grain from a particular basin, reverberates down the line, forcing adjustments elsewhere. Those adjustments in turn can destabilize yet more nodes. From within the system, especially if you sit in a palace that has always depended on distant mines and distant farmers, the experience might feel like everyone is failing at once. Your scribes list missing shipments from multiple directions. Your diplomats report trouble in several neighbouring courts. Your own city sees unrest. The wider pattern is one of network reconfiguration, but from your limited horizon it looks like collapse. As the 3rd millennium BC draws to a close, those networks do not vanish. People still trade, metal still moves, but the old pathways and old guarantees are gone. New routes are forming, New centres are rising, and old powers are discovering what it means to depend on a supply chain that no longer responds the way it used to. And when goods and guarantees slip away, people move, out of failing cities, away from unreliable fields, toward whatever pockets of stability they can find. To follow the next part of this story, we have to follow them. When the goods thin out and the guarantees evaporate, the next thing that starts to move is not copper or grain, but people. Not as a panicked stampede all at once, but in waves and trickles. A few families this year, a whole village a generation later. Herds grazing a little farther upslope. Boatmen trying a new stretch of riverbank. Scribes noting more runaways and deserters in their tablets. From the ground, it doesn't feel like the migration period. It feels like choices. If you are a herder in northern Mesopotamia, and the past 3 years the spring rains have come late and gone early, you don't sit and wait for your flocks to starve. You stretch. You push your seasonal routes a little farther north, a little higher into the hills where there is still grass. You know it's risky. Those uplands belong, at least on paper, to somebody else. Another city, another clan, another god. But hungry animals don't care about lines on tablets. You go because the alternative is watching lambs drop in the dust. If you are a farmer in a low-lying field of southern Sumer and the canal water barely reaches your plot anymore, you have your own calculus. The soil is getting salty, yields are down, the palace still wants its share. Maybe your cousin writes from a town nearer the Euphrates, where the water is more dependable and the officials are less demanding. Maybe a caravan leader passing through talks about good land opening up in the north, in the rain-fed plains where the barley doesn't depend on the temper of the canals. Leaving is not your first instinct. You have a house, a family tomb in the corner of the courtyard where your parents are buried, a small shrine niche with a clay figurine of your household god. But there's a point at which the numbers don't work. You can't feed your children and meet your obligations and keep up the rituals for the ancestors. So you start with a son sent to a relative in another town, or you take seasonal work on a building project upriver and just don't come back. Mobility in this world is not irrational. It is a tool, a way to even out the spikes of risk that drought and politics keep throwing at you. From the vantage point of the great temples and palaces, though, these movements can look very different. If you're a scribe writing in the service of a king, and you see your tax base eroding, your labourers slipping away to other lords or to the hills, you don't describe them as hard-pressed families making rational decisions. You describe them as rebels, runaways, foreigners with strange tongues who are filling the land like locusts. Later, when poets and chroniclers turn this time into literature, the moving people get sharper outlines. In Mesopotamia, they might become the Amorites, the Westerners with their tents and herds. In Egypt, Asiatics from across the Sinai. To the city dwellers clinging to old hierarchies, they are barbarians, rough-clothed, improperly shaved, devoted to the wrong gods. Archaeology complicates that story. When we dig into the layers that span this period, we do not always find a neat line where invaders arrive, burn everything, and build something completely different on top. In some places, yes, there are thick destruction layers, charred beams, smashed walls, arrowheads embedded in collapsed mud brick. In others, there is something softer, houses gradually abandoned, not rebuilt, public buildings left to silt up, pottery styles shifting over a few generations, not overnight. On some Syrian tells, you can see a crowded late 3rd millennium city give way to a thinner scatter of occupation in the early 2nd millennium. Fewer big buildings, more small houses. Sometimes the new pottery looks a bit different, forms and decorations that might reflect people with different habits, different culinary traditions. But the site is still there. The water source is still being used. There is no sign that an army wiped it from the map. What you see, instead of a single invasion, is more like a slow blending. Local city folk staying, newcomers filtering in, old families marrying daughters to herders who now winter their flocks near the city walls. Violence certainly happens in this landscape, but it is patchy and uneven. A fortified town might be stormed, its grain stores looted, its walls blackened in a season of war. A nearby village, a few kilometres away, might simply see its young men conscripted and its surplus taken as tax, but its houses continue much as before. Another settlement, perched on marginal land, might be quietly abandoned, its inhabitants melting into kin networks elsewhere without a single spear being thrown. To the people living through it, The threat of violence is real enough. City-states and small kingdoms shaken by shortages and political struggles respond to mobile populations with increased suspicion and with concrete measures. Fortifications are one of the clearest. Around this time, you see more towns ringed with walls, or old walls thickened and heightened. Not just grand royal capitals, but modest hilltop sites in Syria, Anatolia, and Iran. Gates are funneled, flanked by towers. Access points to canals and river crossings are watched more closely. Walls are not just about barbarians beyond the frontier. They're about neighbours, rival cities, disgruntled subjects. A wall lets a ruler claim, inside is order, outside is chaos. It turns mobility into a problem that needs to be contained. Inside the walls, states respond to stress by tightening their grip on people, as well as on goods. We see ration systems become more important in some places. In Mesopotamia, texts from slightly later but shaped by these same pressures show temples and palaces organising large work crews paid not in coin, but in measured portions of grain and oil. In hard times, those rations are both lifeline and leash. To receive them, you have to be registered, counted, present where the overseer expects you to be. Forced labour, corvée, also ramps up. Canal clearing, wall building, military campaigns, all need bodies. When voluntary labour dries up because people are moving away or hiding in the countryside, officials resort more often to compulsion. Lists of missing men in tablets hint at a constant cat-and-mouse game between state demands and individual avoidance. Alongside the practical measures comes a flood of ideology. Kings in this period, or shortly after, are eager to present themselves as restorers of order in a world gone wrong. Their inscriptions talk about making the land stable, returning the gods to their temples and feeding the hungry, putting the lazy and wandering to work. Newcomer groups, those Western herders in Mesopotamia, or foreign-speaking labourers in Egypt, can be cast either as dangerous outsiders who must be subdued, or as loyal servants who have recognised the king's justice. Both stories are propaganda. Both serve to make a mobile, shiftable population legible and manageable from the palace's point of view. On the ground, identities are less rigid. Imagine a small group of pastoralists arriving each year to the outskirts of a city they once only skirted from a distance. At first they trade, wool, animal products, maybe a few metal objects obtained through their own networks, exchange for grain and pots. They camp outside the walls. City people mutter about their smell, their gods, their different way of speaking. Over a generation or two, lines blur. One family settles permanently, taking up a house near the edge of town. A daughter of a local potter marries a herder's son. Children grow up speaking both languages, knowing both ways of life. They might take city names, worship city gods, but also keep a few older rituals, a prayer said quietly under the breath before the flocks move out. Language itself starts to shift. Loan words filter into everyday speech, terms for particular kinds of sheep, or for grazing rights, or for the new forms of house and tent that appear in the archaeological record. Writing at first lags behind. Scribes keep using the old formal vocabulary of temples and taxes. But sometimes a new term sneaks into a tablet, a hint that the world outside the tablet room is changing. In some regions, these blended communities become the basis for new elites. People whose grandparents were labelled Amorites or Asiatics in the old texts rise to thrones in cities that once despised them. They adopt the trappings of the earlier states, the titles, the gods, the building styles, but bring their own kin networks and loyalties. The old urban order, in which certain lineages and priesthoods dominated, gives way to something more mixed. From a distance of 4,000 years, we can see this as a pattern. Waves of movement, friction at frontiers, eventual integration and reorganization. But to an individual living through it, it is less abstract. It is standing in the doorway of a house your grandparents built, looking out at a landscape that no longer behaves the way they said it would. The canal is lower, the caravan road is quieter, the taxes are heavier. There is a rumour that in the north, or up the river, or across the mountains, there is a place where the fields still yield, where the local lord is kinder, where the gods seem to listen. It is packing what you can onto donkeys, grain jars, tools, a few pieces of jewellery, and deciding what cannot come. The heavy grinding stone your mother used every day, the clay figurine in the family shrine, the bones of the ancestors in their niche in the floor. Do you disturb them, rebury them somewhere safer? carry a handful of their dust with you? Or do you ask the household god to understand that you are leaving in order that your children might live? For others, the move is less total. They become seasonal migrants, summers in the north, winters in the south, never fully belonging to one place again. Their children grow up with multiple homes, a pattern that will become very familiar in later human history. All along, the search that guides these movements is remarkably consistent. People are not chasing collapse or empire. They are chasing reliability. Not perfect abundance. No one expects that. But water they can count on often enough to plant, graze and raise children without constant terror. A river that doesn't vanish entirely every other year. A spring that has not yet failed. A hill slope where the rains so far still come. Sometimes they find it. New towns appear on more favourable ground. Old minor settlements swell into regional centres. New states, drawing on mixed populations and reconfigured trade, begin to write their own histories. Sometimes they do not. Some places that look promising in one decade turn harsh in the next. Migrants move on again, or disappear into the genealogy of another people, remembered only as a vague reference in a text about those who came before. When we stitch together the tablets, the ruins, the shifting layers of ash and mud brick and pottery, what we see around 2200 BC is not a single neat story of invasion and fall. It is a world in motion, full of people using movement as one more strategy among many to cope with a climate that had become unreliable and with states that were themselves struggling to adapt. Out of that motion, new patterns eventually emerge, new powers, new centres of gravity, new ways of organising water and work. To understand what, if anything, caused the shared sense of crisis at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, we have to hold on to all these layers at once: climate, trade, politics, and the quiet, stubborn decisions of families trying to survive. In the next part, we'll pull back again and ask the hardest question of all. Was there truly a single catastrophe that broke these early empires, or was the apparent simultaneity an illusion created by many smaller crises converging at the same time? If you were one of those families on the road, you would not stop in the dust, look up at the sky and declare, "Ah yes, the 4.2 kilo-year event has arrived." You would say, the rains failed again. The river is low, the officials are harsher, the neighbours are nervous. Something is wrong. Looking back from 4,000 years away, we have sharper labels and bigger concepts. We talk about collapse. We talk about the 4.2K event. We talk about systemic failure. But when we try to answer the simple question, what caused it? The ground under our feet becomes just as slippery as the dried-out canal beds of Sumer. We can list the suspects. First, drought and climate instability. The cores pulled from lakes and marshes across the Near East do show changes around this time. Less water, more dust, shifts in the tiny shells and pollen grains that signal drying conditions. In some regions, these signatures line up eerily well with the dates when cities thin out or records fall silent. Second, salinization and soil exhaustion. In southern Mesopotamia, we have very concrete evidence. Crop yields declining over generations. More salt-tolerant grains replacing less tolerant ones, texts complaining about failing fields. Centuries of irrigation, poorly drained, had left salt creeping upward through the soil, turning rich farmland into something closer to a crusted pan. Third, overextension. Empires like Akkad had grown fast. They stretched supply lines across deserts and mountains, kept garrisons far from home, demanded labour and resources from people who did not necessarily see much benefit. In good years, the system just about worked. In bad years, every extra demand could feel like a breaking point. Fourth, war and internal conflict. We do find destruction layers. We have texts describing revolts, sieges, kings marching out with armies to punish rebels and repel foreigners. When central authority weakens, ambitious local leaders seize opportunities. Some cities burn not because the weather is dry, but because someone thought they could do better ruling in their own name. Fifth, epidemic. Here, the evidence is thinner. We don't have clear mass graves with signs of plague. We do have later traditions that remember pestilence and evil winds, and we know that crowded cities with stressed populations are fertile ground for disease. Epidemics probably swept through at times, but whether they were cause, effect, or background noise to other crises is hard to say. Sixth, economic fragility. When your high-status goods, tin for bronze, lapis from Afghanistan, timber from distant mountains, Depend on long-distance trade, any disruption in those networks can ripple through your whole political order. Caravan routes made insecure by drought, banditry or border wars can cut off the very things that cement elite loyalty and royal prestige. Each of these forces is plausible. In some places we can point to tablets, sediment layers, and ruined walls and say, this clearly mattered here. What we cannot do with any honesty is point to a single global trigger and say, this is it. This is the one thing that toppled every major power at once. Part of the problem is simply resolution, our ability to see time clearly in the past. Radiocarbon dates come with error bars. Layers in a tell might blend a few decades into one smear of mud brick and ash. Written chronicles are rare, biased, and often copied centuries later. When we say, around 2200 BC, we're already compressing perhaps 50, maybe even 100 years of slow change, punctuated by a few sharp blows. In that blurred window, things that look simultaneous from far away might have been staggered, cascading one into another like a row of tiles falling at slightly different times. Egypt's old kingdom does not end on the exact same day that Akkad shrinks. The urban fabric of the Indus world does not unravel in the same decade that Syrian palaces burn. Even within a single region, one city might be deserted, while another a few days' walk away rebuilds and carries on. Regional differences complicate the picture further. The 4.2K drought seems strongest in the Levant and northern Mesopotamia. Egypt shows some signs of Lower Nile floods. Parts of Iran and Anatolia may have been affected differently. The Indus Basin, with its monsoon-fed rivers, has its own signature, not a simple mirror of conditions in the West. So when we speak about a global event, we're really layering together many local stories, each with its own rhythm. A run of dry years here, a failed harvest there, a civil war in one kingdom, a trade route rerouted in another. What begins to emerge from this messy mosaic is not a single-cause catastrophe, but a pattern of interaction. Climate stress, those years of unreliable rain, low river levels, shifting flood patterns, acts less like a hammer that smashes everything at once and more like a multiplier. It takes whatever vulnerabilities already exist in a society and magnifies them. If you are farming on marginal land with thin soils, a few bad years might tip you into abandonment. If you are irrigating intensively without good drainage, drought forces you to squeeze your fields harder, accelerating salinization. If your state rests on heavy taxation, forced labor, and grudging loyalty, a poor harvest turns resentment into rebellion. Under stable conditions, overextension might be manageable. An empire can shuffle resources to cover shortfalls, send grain from surplus regions to deficit ones, reward generals and governors enough to keep them loyal. But when several regions suffer stress at once, the system's buffers shrink. There is less surplus to move around, fewer resources to buy peace. Decisions made generations earlier, where to place canals, which crops to favour, how to organise labour, how harshly to tax, suddenly reveal their hidden costs. Some scholars talk about this as a tipping point problem. You can pile stress onto a complex system for a long time, and nothing obvious happens. It bends, it creaks, it improvises. Then one more shock, perhaps not even the largest, pushes it past a threshold. Feedback loops reinforce each other. Institutions lose legitimacy. People stop believing that the centre can hold. From the outside, that final phase can look like a sudden collapse. From the inside, it feels like a long series of smaller, understandable decisions finally adding up to something nobody intended. This is where resilience and recovery come in. Not all institutions fail equally. Some states implode, others shrink and adapt. Some cities vanish from the record, others stumble, reorganize, and continue under new rulers or new rules. Why? Part of it is geography. A city with access to multiple water sources, or with fields that can switch between irrigation and rain-fed agriculture, has more options than one locked into a single vulnerable canal. A kingdom with varied landscapes, delta, valley, highlands, can shuffle people and resources internally in ways a purely lowland empire cannot. Part of it is social flexibility. Polities that can renegotiate obligations, lighten burdens in hard years, or incorporate newcomers without too much rigidity, may weather shocks better than those that insist on the old order at all costs. Some lineages disappear from the record, others reappear under slightly altered titles, claiming ancient legitimacy while quietly changing how power is shared. Temples might lose some of their land but retain ritual authority. Local councils and village elders, barely mentioned in grand inscriptions, quietly keep irrigation ditches functioning and disputes mediated through turbulent decades. When an empire falls, not everything falls with it. Weights and measures, basic legal customs, religious festivals, shared myths of origins, these often persist, carried by people who have no interest in seeing everything burned down. Later rulers, even if they come from once despised barbarian groups, inherit and reuse those tools. So when we say nobody knows what caused it, we need to be precise about what that nobody knows really means. We are not in total darkness. For some regions, the combination of climate proxies, archaeology, and texts makes certain things very likely. In northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, it is very likely that a period of drying and cooling made rain-fed farming harder and contributed to urban contraction. In southern Mesopotamia, it is very likely that soil salinization undermined the old agricultural base over the long term. In Egypt, it is very likely that a series of low Nile floods put fiscal strain on the Old Kingdom's centralized pyramid-building state. In other areas, like parts of Iran, Anatolia, and especially the Indus, our confidence drops. We can see that things change, cities reconfigure, building patterns shift, certain crafts decline, but tying those shifts to specific causes is more speculative. Maybe climate, maybe changing trade routes, maybe internal political transformations, probably some combination we have not fully grasped. And then there are hypotheses that remain intriguing but uncertain. Pandemics that we can't yet trace in the bones, social ideologies that might have lost their hold on people's imaginations, small technological shifts that cascaded through economies. Collapse, in this light, becomes less a single mystery to be solved and more a layered field of probabilities. Here we can say very likely. There we must say possibly. In some corners we can only whisper perhaps. What ties all these levels together is a simple, quiet thought. For the people who lived through it, the end of an empire was not the end of the world. It was a turning of the page that they did not know they were writing. A scribe who switched from carving the name of an Akkadian king to a local ruler did not think, I am now in a post-collapse period. A farmer who left a salty field for a wetter valley did not think, I am helping to found the Middle Bronze Age. They thought, how do I get through this season? How do I secure next year? From our distance we see big chapters, early bronze, Old Kingdom, Akkad, Indus urbanism. We see a cluster of endings around 2200 BC, and we name it a crisis. But beneath that label, life flowed on. Children were born in the shadow of half-ruined walls. New gods quietly joined old pantheons. Trade routes bent around broken bridges and found new passes through the hills. Languages absorbed new words. Families kept burying their dead and telling stories about the time before. The page turned. The book did not close. When you listen closely to the silence after the storm, you can sometimes hear the scratching of new lines being written, modest, local, experimental. The seeds of the next age sown in fields that had only just begun to feel reliable again. What caused the great wave of endings around 2200 BC? Many things, pushing and pulling in different places, amplified by a climate that had become less forgiving. What came after was not a neat recovery, but a slow, uneven reweaving of order. In that gap between the fall of old structures and the rise of new ones is where the rest of our story waits. If you stay with that gap for a moment, the space between falling and reweaving, you start to see the year 2200 BC a little differently, not as a single night when every light went out at once, but as a long dusk spread over decades and centuries, where some lamps guttered, some were snuffed, and others were quietly carried to new rooms. We began with the puzzle. Why do so many different traditions remember some kind of break around this time? Why do archaeologists see abandoned palaces in Syria, shrinking fields in Sumer, political fragmentation in Egypt, slow urban change in the Indus, shifts in Anatolia and Iran? After walking through all those places, the answer is less like a clean equation and more like a braided river. Climate stress, what we call the 4.2K event, seems to have been one channel. A tendency toward drier, more unstable conditions in many regions, making old farming routines less reliable. Local ecological problems formed another. Salt in the soil of southern Mesopotamia, overworked land, forests cut back faster than they could regrow. Human choices and institutions braided in as well. Empires stretched thin, heavy demands placed on farmers and craft workers, armies marching, trade routes over-dependent on a few vulnerable links. Layer on possible disease, economic fragility, ideological fatigue, and the neat picture dissolves. There is no single, universally proven cause. There is a family of overlapping pressures arriving at slightly different times in different places, revealing which societies had deep reserves of flexibility and which were already brittle. If that sounds unsatisfying, if you were hoping for one dramatic culprit, it might help to remember that this is often how big changes work even now. Systems absorb stress, improvise, adjust, until they don't. From far away, it looks like a sudden break. Up close, it is a long negotiation with limits. And yet, as we followed those negotiations, another pattern emerged. After the dust of collapsed palaces settled, people kept digging canals, but sometimes in new directions. They kept raising temples, but with different patrons' names carved on the bricks. They founded new cities on higher ground, shifted fields to fresher soils, rewrote old myths to fit new dynasties. The ancient world did not end around 2200 BC. It turned, like a river forced out of its old bed, cutting new channels through the same landscape. If you've been listening to this in the dark, maybe lying down, you can imagine those rivers now. Night over Sumer, stars reflecting in water that still runs through half-silted canals. Night over the Nile, the current sliding past fields that will belong to a different kind of kingdom in a few generations. Night over the Indus, where city streets are slowly rearranged, wells dug, houses rebuilt on slightly different plans. The empires whose names fill textbooks are the noisy part of the story. The silence after the storm is quieter, but it is where most people actually lived, in the work of adjusting, of getting by, of trying something a little different because the old way no longer quite fit. When historians, archaeologists, and climate scientists listen to that silence, they use different tools: cores of mud and ice, broken pots, shifted burial grounds, faded ink on clay. They are listening for patterns. Where did people move? Which crops changed? When do new kinds of objects appear? When do old titles vanish? None of this will ever give us a perfect frame-by-frame replay, but it does give us something strangely comforting. A picture of human beings facing uncertainty, sometimes failing, often adapting, always leaving traces for distant descendants to puzzle over. Which brings the question back to you. After hearing all these threads, climate, soil, war, trade, politics, what feels most convincing to you as the main driver in this great turning? Or do you think it only makes sense as a tangle of many causes, none of them sufficient on their own? If you're still awake, I'd love to know your thoughts. When you have a moment, tell me in the comments which theory you found most compelling, and why. And also, because I always enjoy seeing this, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there right now. Some of you are drifting off in the middle of the night, some of you are folding laundry in the afternoon. All of you are, in your own way, listening in on the echoes of a very old storm. If you've enjoyed this deep, slow walk through the past, it really helps if you tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. It's a small modern way of sending a little signal forward, telling the algorithm gods that there are people who want long, quiet stories about history. And if you'd like to go even further back, to the ice ages, the bottlenecks, the almost ends and strange new beginnings in our species' prehistory, I've written a book about those deep time secrets. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. It's built to be read the same way these episodes are meant to be heard. Slowly, peacefully, with room to drift and wonder, and, when you need to, sleep. For now, we'll leave the world of 2200 BC settling into its new channels. The canals are still there in the dark. The Nile is still rising and falling. The Indus is still whispering past baked brick quays. New kings are learning old rituals. Children are growing up thinking that this arrangement, these borders, these gods, these worries, is how it has always been. They do not know that 4,000 years from now someone will lie awake, listening to the almost silence of a voice trying to reconstruct their world. You can let their story fade now if you like. You know that the storm passed. You know that the quiet after was not empty. It was full of experiments, of new ways of living, of people who did not yet know they were building the foundations for the ages to come. Whenever you're ready, you can follow them into sleep, and when you wake, the past will still be there, waiting, like a river that has found yet another channel.